Wow, what a treat it is to interview David Rubenstein, right? David, about how many interviews did you do on your show?
I've done about 200 of them so far on the various shows, and then I've done some that are not on TV, but I've done some interviewing over the years.
And some interviewing over the years, yeah, I'd say.
I interviewed here on this stage. I interviewed you.
Yes, you did, and you did it very well, which makes it more challenging for me. So I'll do my best, but you'll give me pointers if I need them as we're going along. What I found in your books, you wrote 3 books. One on the leadership, the second on, the American dream and the American reality, and third on investing. I counted that there were 31 interviews on how to lead, 27 interviews on the Great American Experiment, and 23 interviews. So that equaled 81 plus 200 or so is 281 interviews. And never once do we know what you think, right?
Well, a good interviewer is supposed to let the interviewee be the star of the show, right? So I don't want to be an interviewer who basically says, here's what I think about something, go through a long explanation, and then give the person 1 second to say what they think. So I try not to do that.
Well, we get to switch roles here.
Okay.
Like on your books, very, very interesting. On your books, the greatest minds and the greatest leaders, greatest investors are part of it. But you're a great leader and a great investor. And what's differentiated us, I wrote 3 books, you wrote 3 books. What differentiates us is that I spent all this time passing along the principles that I thought were worthwhile, and you picked the principles, and we're going to switch roles here, and we're going to need to get your principles out of you and know what David Rubenstein thinks.
Well, they're different principles. You've written a book on principles, which is the principles of life. And these are the principles you wrote about are the ones you operate your life on and your company. And is that what you mean? Or there's a different thing is principles of investing.
Yep, there's principles. What I mean by principles is when you're in a position and you have to make a decision, it's kind of the recipe by your decision-making criteria when you're in that position to make it. And because you have a great track record, and I have somewhat of a track record, we're in a position where we must have made enough good decisions to be where we are, and we need to pass those along to others at our stage of our life, I believe. And so that's why I want to get your principles.
Well, principles of investing, principles of life, or both?
No, there's principles for everything. There's principles for marriages. There's principles for everything, right? So principles are for everything, and I want to start with your principles for life. So, which I'll get to.
Okay.
So bear with me.
All right, go ahead.
Okay. So, just a little bit of your background. By the way, your background parallels my background in uncanny ways, so I'm going to learn a little bit more about myself by interviewing you, I think. So you were born on August 11th, 1949. I was born on August 8th, 1949, so you were born 3 days later than I am. And your background was somewhat similar to mine in that you were born in modest means. Your dad was a postman.
Right.
And as I understand it, he really never earned more than $7,000 a year.
Basically.
And your mother was a homemaker. In my case, my dad was a jazz musician, and it wasn't probably the same amount of money. My mom was a homemaker. And then when you were 12, when I was 12, John Kennedy inspired you.
Right.
And he inspired me. And you wanted to go into government. And so you went to Duke, not only because it's a great school, but also because you could get the best scholarship deal there. And you then graduated from Duke. You went to a wonderful law firm. And then you went into government. You went to as the chief lawyer of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and then you worked there for in the Carter administration for I think the 4 years of the Carter administration, and then you turned to the dark side.
Well, I had no choice. We lost the election in 1980 to Ronald Reagan. So, people come up to you and tell you how great you are when you have power, and then the day after you lose the election, nobody wants to return your phone calls. So it's a different situation. So I had to...
You had to go to the dark side.
Well, I had to go back and practice law. It's the only thing I knew, but I didn't know how to do practicing. I wasn't really a good lawyer. I didn't have the skill set. So, and my clients kept telling me that. So I had to do something different, and I was inspired by Bill Simon, who was the Secretary of Treasury in the Ford administration, who we had replaced, and he had done a famous deal you're probably familiar with, Gibson greeting cards, where he put in roughly $1 million of his own money and made roughly $80 million in roughly 18 months. And I read about that, and I said, that's better than practicing law. I don't know what a leveraged buyout is, but I'm going to learn, and I'll figure out if I could build a leveraged buyout firm in Washington, not in New York.
So now, you never went back to government, but you've always been very close around government. And
Well, I've never been invited back, because if you get inflation to 18%, they don't invite you back.
Would you go back?
I couldn't be confirmed for anything today, because today, if you have made a fair amount of money, it's impossible to get confirmed generally. And then also, if you have a reasonable reputation, it could easily be destroyed by one senator putting a hold on you, and people think you've done something nefarious, and you could get blocked. So it's very difficult to get confirmed today, and I just don't know that I want to subject my family to all the criticism that would come of me if I'm trying to be confirmed for something. Not that anybody's offered me any jobs.
What do you think about that? It's very difficult now. The world has changed a lot since we heard John Kennedy speak.
Well,
what do you think about?
It used to be the case. When I worked in the Senate, there was bipartisanship. Today, I host a dinner for members of Congress once a month, and I ask them to sit with people from the opposite party, and they love it, and they say, sadly or not, this is the most interesting thing they're doing in Congress, is going to this dinner, because they can be themselves. They don't have to, raise money. They don't have to be seen by the press and so forth. In the days when I worked on Capitol Hill briefly, and when I worked in the White House, bipartisanship was something that a legislator was thought to be a good one if he could get bipartisan, or she could get bipartisan legislation through. Now, if you're bipartisan, you're almost written out of the party. And it's a different world than it was when I was doing it many years ago.
Yeah, as you know, in my study of looking at the polarity, there's populism of the left, populism of the right, and what you're referring to. What do you think about that? Do you think it weakens our democracy? Do you think...
Well, it doesn't help. And let me explain the reason for it to some extent. It's not like people go into office and run for office and say, I want to do something bad as an office holder. They all have the best of intentions, I would say, or most of them have the best of intentions. But the problem is this: once you get into Congress, you're afraid you're going to get out of Congress. The job doesn't pay much. It pays less than $200,000 a year. 75 members of the House have to live in their own offices because they can't afford another apartment in Washington, D.C., so they don't make much money. But to raise money, which is what they need to stay in office, if you raise money, you're more likely to win elections. And if you raise money after you lose the election, you can keep that money, more or less, not for personal purposes. So they're always raising money. The House members are spending 40% of their time raising money. And when you raise money, you don't raise it on the basis that I'm going to do bipartisan things, I'm going to work with the party of the opposite party. You raise it by appealing to the far left or the far right. And so the parties are just more and more split than they used to be. And it used to be, money's always been the mother's milk of politics, but the problem is that now you need to raise so much more, and also you can now give so much more. In the old days, you could give $1,000 and you're done. Now you can give unlimited amounts of money. So people who have large sums of money to give get listened to a lot more by members of Congress, and they tend to be on the far left or the far right. So it's not a great situation for democracy.
Hell of a system.
Well, it's better than every other system. I mean, obviously, it's not perfect, and as Winston Churchill famously said, democracy is the worst form of government except every other one. He didn't know about fundraising, though. He might have not been as happy. In other countries, so you lived in Singapore for 3 months, about a year ago or so, to do some work there. In Singapore, I talked to the prime minister. I interviewed him once, and he told me he had an election campaign. I said, well, how many months was it? He said, no, it's 4 days. So it's 4 days. It was only 4 days. And so, if you had shorter campaigns and money wasn't a factor, we might have a better democracy.
Because we have such polarity and populism on each side, a populist is a person who will win at all cost. Do you worry about democracy?
Well, I worry about lots of things. If you're Jewish, you worry about lots of stuff,
We
right?
can get to the other things, too.
I'm always worried about something. But, the democracy that our founding fathers created was not something they honestly thought would last. Thomas Jefferson didn't think it would last more than 20 years. So the fact that you've got a document that's lasted more than 200 years with 27 amendments is amazing. But it's still not a perfect democracy, and I don't know what is a perfect democracy. It's clear the country we're not in as bad shape as we were during the Civil War. During the Civil War, we lost roughly 3% of our population. Today, that would be roughly 10 million people or so. And lost by battlefield deaths or disease or other things. Today, we're not killing each other at that kind of level. We obviously have a lot of tension, and there are some people that have lost their lives because of fights over democracy and so forth. But it's not as bad as it was, but the tensions are not good.
Yeah, not as good as, better than the Civil War.
Better than the Civil War, that's for sure.
Now, on this choice that you made of being in the career that you went into versus being in government, how do you view the pros and cons of that decision?
Well, in government, it's great to say I want to serve my country and be in government, and a lot of people do that, and I think they deserve a lot of credit for it because the compensation is low, that you're not very thanked very much, it's long hours and so forth. But you do get a sense you're doing something to make the country somewhat better, and in certain areas. But I do think that in the business I'm now in, it's a business where you're designed to improve companies, make the companies better, and that helps the economy. And so what I say in the book is that it's not a terrible thing to be an investor who's very good, because you're a good investor, you make a fair amount of money, but you give away that money. Most of the investors are ultimately giving away the bulk of the money. You are, and I are, we both original signers of the Giving Pledge. So we're basically giving away our money. And then you're also creating a lot of jobs. You've created a lot of jobs. My firm has created a lot of jobs. So it's not a terrible thing to be an investor. It's not like you're a nefarious person. On the other hand, I recognize that day to day when I wake up, I may not have the same influence that I would have if I was in the White House as a senior advisor to the president.
So what's the straight answer, yes or no?
Well, happiness is the most elusive thing in life, for sure. And very difficult to be happy, and most people I know are not that happy. And actually, the wealthiest people I know are often the most tortured souls. How are you doing?
Well, you look happy to me.
I'm happy, but I'm unusual, maybe in some sense. I'm very happy, but I've reached an age where a lot of the tensions and the challenges of life, I've kind of gone through some of them. And so you told me earlier that you think the happiest age for people tend to be when they're post, let's say, 55 or 60, they tend to be happier than when they're 35 or 40. And so I'm happy. Happiness is hard to measure. There's no happiness index, but I'm doing only things I want to do. Giving away my money. My children are now happy and healthy, and they're in their own business. They're all in the private equity business, so that's good, right? And also, I feel I've done some philanthropic things that are good. Some I could do better. You've done a great deal in the philanthropy too, so I'm pretty happy. And I don't want to live my life over again. I mean, everybody would like to live longer.
What a terrific life you have had. Really, I just want to say, I'm a great admirer of you living the American dream and then contributing so much. I just want to read some of the things that you do. David Rubenstein is chairman of the board of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, the Council of Foreign Relations, the National Gallery of Art, the Economic Club of Washington, and the University of Chicago. He is also a fellow of the Harvard Corporation, a trustee of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, Johns Hopkins Medicine, the Institute for Advanced Study, the National Constitution Center, the Brookings Institute, and the World Economic Forum. And he's a director of the Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, the American Academy of Arts and Science. He's also a member of the American Philosophical Society, Business Council, Harvard Global Advisory. I'd take up most of the time if I kept continuing to read these things.
You could do the same things. You could
No,
be on
no,
any
no,
of those
no. I
boards you
don't
want.
hold. I honestly do not hold a candle to any of that. And I wanted to get into your subliminal motivations, because one of the things you said in our discussions was that when you think about your children or the children of people who have a lot, that could be a curse.
Oh, sure.
To have a lot, that's a challenge. Just a second.
Okay, go ahead.
You'll clarify. Do you think that the not having much and that achievement subliminally affected your drive? And I'm asking the question to reflect even on myself. We don't know the subliminal, but in other words, you extraordinary person of modest means, background, and these tremendous accomplishments, and the subliminal is our real motivator. What do you think subliminally motivated you to go from that one background to all that you've accomplished and done?
My Jewish mother, maybe. No, I would say when you don't have money and you don't grow up with a lot of wealth, you're obviously, not always, but you're going to be more driven probably. If you grow up in a very wealthy family, it's harder to have the drive. And I've said before that raising children is the most difficult thing in the world. And as anybody who's raised children know, you're always worried whether they're happy, healthy, and safe, and so forth. But if you raise children, you've got a lot of money, and you have the same situation I do, you could be careful, because your kids might say, well, my father's going to give me money, or my mother's going to give me money, they don't have to work very hard. So it's very difficult, much harder to raise children when you have a lot of money. And we've all seen the children of very wealthy people who didn't accomplish that much. The people that generally are the greatest accomplishers and the people who are the greatest leaders tend to come from blue-collar backgrounds and middle-class backgrounds. The people in this book are basically from blue-collar or middle-class backgrounds. The wealthiest people in the world, it's hard to imbue ambition in those children. Now, there are obviously exceptions to every rule, and there are some people who I'm sure from billionaire families that are hardworking and have done a lot, but as a general rule of thumb, you're more motivated to prove something and accomplish something if you don't have anything to begin with. And so in my case, I was trying to, make a life for myself that my parents would think was, useful.
That's so true. I have a friend who's a psychiatrist who wrote a book called The Gift of Adversity, which I think is, I look at study the dynasties in history and so on, you find that, just as you say, that the most successful people, you can't tell where they come from. So how do you think about our society now in which there is not equal opportunity? In other words,
Well, there's never been equal opportunity.
I'm not talking about exactly equal opportunity. I'm talking about the fact, when we grew up, I could go to a public high school that was good. I was lucky enough to have parents who took care of me and so on. And that's basically all that I needed, all that you needed probably. But we have situations, I'm state of Connecticut, my wife works in there, 22% of the high school students in Connecticut are disengaged or disconnected in poverty in their environment. Disengaged means that their absentee rate is greater than 25%, they're failing classes. Disconnected means they don't know where they are because they've dropped out of school. This is not equal opportunity, never totally equal, but it's different. Do you disagree with that? Do you think that we could draw from the population?
Well, the income disparity is greater than it ever was. And there's no doubt there are a lot of people who have staggering sums of money, and there are a lot of people at the bottom. One of the most tragic things is that people believe in the American dream who typically come to this country. We have 50 million immigrants in this country, more than any other country in the world. No other country is even close to attracting that many immigrants. The immigrants tend to believe in the American dream, and they come here for that reason. Many people now who are born in this country, particularly those in the lower socioeconomic classes, do not believe in the American dream as much as they used to. And I would say, particularly in often minorities, they don't believe in it because they don't see that they're going to rise up. And we have a problem in this country for, take literacy, for example. About 30% of Americans are functionally illiterate, which means they can't read past the 4th grade level. And you can't read very well, or you're unable to read at all, you're not likely to rise up. So we have lots of challenges in our country. While it's got a lot of great resources, we have a lot of problems, we're not going to solve that problem anytime soon. If I knew what the solution was, I'd be in Iowa, New Hampshire, and so forth. But there's no easy answer to solving that income disparity problem or the lack of equal opportunity.
What are you going after?
Well, what I'm trying to do now is,
Not do, I mean, in other words, what is it that fulfills David Rubenstein?
Well, I like it when I have a famous person interviewing me because usually it's a role reversal, so that I could attract you, or why I could attract you, that makes me feel good. But what I like is feeling I'm giving back to the country. Because of my last name, I'm not sure that I could have achieved this in some other countries. There was a show last night on PBS about the Holocaust and how the United States didn't do as much to prevent the Holocaust as it could have. It was a Ken Burns documentary that was well done, I thought. And Jews came to this country, and my parents, my great-grandparents came here, grandparents came here, but they came here at the bottom of the economic totem pole, and there was a lot of prejudice then. Today, I think the country is much less prejudiced against people like me. Obviously, people who are Jewish is less prejudiced than it was. But I want to give back to the country. So a lot of my gifts, as you note, have been to try to make the country somewhat better. That I realize no one philanthropist is going to make the country better by him or herself.
But you're a leader in patriotic philanthropy. You've made big changing impact on the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, Jefferson Memorial, Monticello, the Kennedy Center, the Smithsonian, Library of Congress, National Museum of African American History and Culture. You've bought copies and shared copies of the Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, and so on. So you, in my opinion, personify that American dream, and I share your views about immigrants and such things, and so is accomplishing important?
Well, I think people have a greater appreciation of what they've done and what they're about if they've accomplished something. If you failed at everything you've ever done in life, you probably wouldn't feel so good about yourself. You'd probably feel better about accomplishing something and actually seeing it. In my philanthropy, I have 4 principles. 1, start something that otherwise wouldn't get started. 2, finish something that otherwise wouldn't get finished. 3, make sure it's something I'm intellectually engaged with, so I'll stay involved, not just write a check. And 4, I'd like to see progress in my lifetime. Now, that excludes some things I'm not going to solve all the problems of the world in my lifetime, but the things I can deal with, I'm trying to deal with. But in the end, people fault me all the time. I was faulted recently in the New York Post saying that I had given money to Monticello and Montpelier to restore them, and then they said now that I'm too woke because the tours of Monticello and Montpelier emphasized the fact that Jefferson and Madison were slave owners. Now, that's not completely accurate in the sense that the tours don't emphasize that. They do mention they were slave owners, and they were slave owners. And George Washington was a slave owner, and many of our first presidents were slave owners. I think in history you should learn the good and the bad and point it out to people. So I don't hide behind what Monticello is doing or Montpelier is doing. But I think it's important that we learn, from the past, and that's one of the reasons I'm cared about history, is teaching people the mistakes we made in the past, hopefully so we can learn how to do things better.
So, but it seems that, as you say, accomplishing is a very high priority for you. Just a second.
I'd like to accomplish something and actually get something done. And most people do too.
There are people, a lot of people who might have a different approach and savor life, go to the ball game, savoring life in a way that doesn't have so much accomplishment. What do you think about life choices like that?
Well, the country allows people to make their choices, and people, based on their upbringing, make their choices that makes them presumably happy. If people are happy going to sporting events, and I go to sporting events too, but if they're happy doing that and it gives them a greater sense of fulfillment or happiness than doing what I'm doing, that's fine. I don't have any problem with it. Everybody can't do the same thing.
So tell me, Orioles or Nationals?
Well, I grew up in Baltimore, and I do think the Orioles, it's a good team, and I live in Washington, so Nationals is a good team, and we'll see what happens.
You sure are a good interviewee. You have diplomacy still left.
Well,
in you.
I've learned, you get in trouble if you say some things you're not supposed to say. I've done that many times in my life. So I'm trying to be careful and not get myself in trouble.
While we're on the subject, I understand that you ran into a little bit of difficulty when you were trying to impregnate a panda. You were trying to impregnate a panda.
Not personally, but no. The panda situation, for those who don't know about it, is that there are only about 2,500 pandas on the face of the earth. There's 7.5 billion people. And why is that? Because pandas have the most unique reproduction system of any mammal. And because also where they historically live, more and more development has occurred in China, so there are very few places they can live anymore. But the female goes into estrus and can reproduce only for 4 hours a day, 1 day a year. That's, you got to be there for that 4-hour period of time. And so.
Were you looking on?
I'd say what happens is in the wild is, when they get together in that 4-hour period of time, they're inexperienced. You only do it 1 day a year for 4 hours. You don't know where the parts are supposed to go. So they don't really, it doesn't work so well. So in captivity, if it doesn't work the normal, natural way, after 2 hours, they will artificially inseminate the female. And sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't.
How did you come by the interest to do that?
Well, it wasn't because of my interest in reproduction necessarily. I was the chairman of the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian owns the National Zoo. And the National Zoo is one of 26 zoos in the world that have pandas, only 3 in the United States. And what happened was they said you have to pay the Chinese about $1 million a year to get the pandas. And the organization that had been paying it for 10 years decided not to do it anymore. So they were afraid they were going to lose the pandas, and so I said, well, I'll put up the money for it. And so then they made me an expert on panda reproduction.
You learn amazing things.
So yeah, they said, do you want to see the artificial insemination, the panda? I said, no. Do you want to see the semen extracted from the male? Absolutely not. I don't want to see that either.
That'd make you cringe.
Yeah, I would.
Failure. A lot of people look at you or I and think, wow, what a tremendous amount of success. These are smart guys. They've become tremendously successful. And I don't think they understand how important failure is in the process. Can you tell me about some of your failures or
well,
what
we don't
you
have
think
all
about
night
failure?
to go through all my failures, but in the book on leadership and in this book, I point out that the great leaders and the great investors have failed because you learn a lot from failure. And I have failed many times. We made some investments that backfired, didn't work out. I missed out on some great investments I should have done, like Facebook or Amazon, Netscape. I passed on them all. I've made a lot of mistakes and lost money for people and myself. So I've had lots of failures, and you have to learn from your failures and get back on your feet. And there's a person I knew many years ago who had never seemed to fail. He went to Harvard, summa cum laude, Rhodes Scholar, Yale Law School, Supreme Court clerk, editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Journal, PhD as well in economics. He never failed in everything, and he was blonde-haired, blue-eyed, chiseled, athletic, and he just never failed. Everybody saw his resume. They said, we need to hire this guy. So they kept giving him great jobs, but when he finally met a real hurdle and he didn't have the temperament to deal with failure, he failed. And didn't do a good job, and so he kind of lost his job. You have to learn how to fail in order to learn how to succeed. Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos, they all had failures. Everybody's had failures if they've accomplished anything. And so in your case, you've written about your failures, and you lost all your money at one point, right? Early on. And you had to go to your father and borrow $4,000.
$4,000. I was so broke that I had to borrow $4,000 from my dad for family expenses.
Right. So you failed, and you obviously did pretty well since then. So I've had lots of failures too, but in the end, you can't dwell on your failures because you won't get anything accomplished. You have to learn from them and get back on your feet.
So principles of life, I'd like to get some of your principles. I think you said that principle so well about failure. Can you say it again? What is the principle for failure?
The principle
for achieving success through failure?
Well,
What would you carry?
If you're going to be successful in life, generally, I think you've got to have a vision of where you want to go. You can't just sit at home and just say, I hope something good will happen. You have to have some initiative and try to do something. Secondly, you have to be prepared. Jim Baker famously said that his father taught him the aphorism, which is prior preparation prevents poor performance. Prior preparation prevents poor performance.
There's a principle.
So, and that's very good. Try to be prepared. Also, try to have some humility if you are successful. There are some great leaders that are not, so humble. And there's some not great leaders that are also not humble. But humility is a virtue. You can't see Abraham Lincoln running around saying, I just won the Civil War. Give me some credit for that. I mean, he never would say that. Great leaders are people you admire because they have some humility. And they have humility because they failed and they know the challenges of life. So humility and self-respect, respect for other people. I think it's obviously one of the golden rules, but I think respecting other people's feelings and trying to not hurt anybody or embarrass anybody in a way that is harmful to them is a useful principle of life.
How have you carried that in your performance? I know when I think about my worry about being wrong, I do two things. I try to find the smartest people who disagree with me to try to stress test, and then I try to diversify. So
right.
I think being in the markets has taught me some things about life, and life is applied to the markets. When you take that humility and so on, how do you carry that to an investment principle or two?
You mean failure or?
The risk of being wrong.
Well, you recognize that in life you're going to be wrong, a lot. And so you have to use your best judgment and use your gut and your instincts. So Warren Buffett, for example, has been, and the book points out that he's compounded his investment success roughly at 20% a year for 60 years, which is pretty good. And so he's made mistakes, but he uses what other people use now is your gut, your intuition, which is basically the set of experiences you've had that lead you to make decisions. So in your case, if you have an investment decision, I assume you don't get a 500-page memo and analyze it and ask everybody and grill everybody. You have gut instincts now. After so many years of doing this, you can make a judgment based on those instincts.
Can you tell us a little bit about a failure? Was 2008 a difficult year?
It was. It was a terrible year for us. We had a bond fund. We were a private equity fund, but we had built a private credit fund, and it broke. It lost basically $1 billion of money. So if you lose $1 billion, that's not good. And we had a lot of investors, and my partners and I were the biggest investors in it. We lost hundreds of millions of dollars of our own money, and so it was not pleasant. And so we had to live through it and deal with the investors. So whenever you lose money for investors, it's not pleasant. Now we've made a lot of money for investors over the a 35-year period of time, but people don't want to hear about your successes when they've lost some of their money.
Do you worry about being long only, and you could see a bad set of circumstances like that again? Do you worry? And what are your lessons that you've learned to prevent getting yourself into that position again?
Well, in that particular case, we over-levered. Basically what we were doing was we were borrowing against, in effect, Ginnie Mae's and Fannie and Freddie Mac securities, as to which you could borrow 98 cents on the dollar in a repo financing. So when you can borrow 98 cents on the dollar, you can lever up quite nicely and enhance the returns. when the crisis happened, all of a sudden J.P. Morgan and other banks said, no, these securities are only worth 90 cents on the dollar. So you have to put up a lot more money. And we didn't have the cash in that facility to put it up. So we lost it, as other people did during that time. So what we learned is, in the lesson of investing is don't put too many eggs in one basket and don't do things that are too risky. Now, nobody anticipated the 07, 08 crisis that well, but clearly it was, it was a terrible time for the markets, the worst time I've ever seen, probably for you too.
No, well, it turns out, not because I go long and short, 2008 turned out to be a great year for us, but...
Okay. But I mean, you look at the stories and what happened during that period of time. There's an excellent book that's coming out in October by John Mack, who was the CEO of Morgan Stanley, and I just interviewed him, and it's about his book, and he points out they came this close to having to take the firm down.
I know it well. Do you think something like that could happen again?
Well, it's always a mistake to say that nothing can happen again that was bad. So there will be crises in the future. There's always been panics, crises, financial calamities. That always happens. That's the way the investment world is. In our case, we've tried to protect against it. I think other firms are too, but nobody is perfect. And if certain things happen to our currency or there were things we can't anticipate, there could always be problems. But right now, I think people have learned about the mistakes of 2007, 2008. But increasingly in my firm, I see people who weren't in the investment world in 2007, 2008. They're young. I was at a meeting recently with some of our people, and these people were very young, and so they haven't lived through that. I mean, I was doing something at the Kennedy Center the other day. We had an exhibition of President Kennedy, and I wanted to have that there because the Kennedy Center is a living memorial to President Kennedy, but 2/3 of Americans were not alive when President Kennedy was alive, including my children. And so they don't really know about President Kennedy. And so you're dealing with young people. They don't have the background of a lot of the young people haven't been through 2007, 2008. So you've got to remind people of this, but you can't remind people of things as much as have them live through it. When you live through it, then you really remember it.
And that's also one of the reasons that when things happen in history before our times, they are risks that might reoccur, I would think. There's some similarities that exist, but I don't want to get into that because I know I have limited time and I want to be able to pass along other questions. But before I do, of these 23 investors that you interviewed...
Including you.
Yeah, including me. There's so many different ways of making money in the markets.
Right.
Are there any common elements?
Sure. The investors, now this was a book of interviewing the greatest investors in our country. And it's not designed to make anybody who reads it a great investor. Nobody is going to read a book about Tiger Woods' golf style and become a great golfer. You have to live the world of investing for most of your life to get to this point. This is a book that's designed for students who might be interested in learning about the investment world and what it takes to be really good. Average investors who say, well, maybe I'll pick some stocks myself or bonds myself, and some tips for them. And then people who don't have the ability to really pick stocks or bonds or other kind of instruments, but want to pick funds and let the fund managers do it. And it's designed to give them some principles. But the great investors do have certain things in common. These are what they have in common. Number one, they tend to be from blue-collar or middle-class families, as I mentioned. Second, they tend to have pretty good skills in academic life. They tend to have pretty good educations. They're not people who generally dropped out of high school and just got lucky by investing well. 3, they tend to be pretty good in math. They're not necessarily math wizards, but they're pretty good in math. 4, they like to make the final decision. They don't like to delegate. They say, all right, give me all the facts and I want to make the decision myself. I'm not going to go home and you make the decision. That's not them. They also are people that are intellectually curious. They just don't want to, they want to know everything they can about everything. They're like intellectual sponges, and not just about their investment area. If they're an expert in, let's say, quantum physics and they invest in that area, they don't want to read only about that. They want to read everything because their thinking is, at some point, some piece of information will come into my brain and I can use it later. So they're incredibly curious and they read enormous amounts. Next, they also tend to be workaholics, I would say. They also tend to be people who are happy. They make mistakes, but they get over it quickly. I'm not probably that good at that. I can remember mistakes for 30 or 40 years, and I can't get over it. But a lot of the great investors, they're on to the next thing. They get out of the bad position, they go on to the next thing, and they don't think about it again. They all have that in common. And the most important thing they have in common, I'd say, is they're willing to go against conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom is buy X or Y or Z. They don't want to buy X or Y or Z. They want to buy A, B, and C or something different. The conventional wisdom is what they generally go against, and they're willing to they have the courage to stand up to the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom is the path of least resistance is always easy to take. If people tell you do this and do that, and you do it, well, nobody's going to yell at you. But if you're going to do something different, people are going to say, well, you know what you're doing, and you might, if you make a mistake, people are going to yell at you because you did something wrong. That takes a lot of courage, and that's what a lot of these people have.
What a great summary. Would you be able to tell a young one who's got it before they demonstrate it?
Well, I can tell certain things. I mean, there was a great investment banker many years ago when I was young and I was involved in the bankruptcy of New York City as a young lawyer, and there was a young investment banker who came in and worked on it. It was Felix Roden. And he had a really brilliant mind. I could see it right away, what a brilliant mind he had. He didn't have an MBA. And I've seen other people who are really good in finance who don't have an MBA. And so I tell young people who come to our firm all the time, if you have this certain skill set, you don't need an MBA. Typically, they have college degrees and they've had some training, but I can tell that 2 or 3 or 4% of people have such intellectual curiosity, such drive, and such a willingness to kind of do what it takes to be great that they don't need to go get an MBA. The opportunity cost for them is too great. But that is not the majority of people. In fact, a lot of people in here don't have MBAs. They're really talented. And you do have an MBA, but I think you wanted an MBA kind of, you didn't do, you love college, but you wanted, I think, have the imprimatur of Harvard Business School. I think I've got it right. Or you certainly got into Harvard Business School and you were happy to went there, right? And so it gave you a certain imprimatur to say, I went to Harvard Business School, it's a great place. And I would say a lot of people in here didn't get that kind of background. They didn't go to business school at all.
I'm going to now turn to some questions from the audience. What's your process for study? Is it reading? Is it notes? Is it anything else? So how do you find the time to do this process right?
For studying,
given all you're doing.
Well,
the process for study, for learning, I assume.
Well, I have some tricks. 1, I don't play golf. That saves a lot of time. 2, I don't drink alcohol. That saves a lot of time too. But also, I interview a lot of authors. And when I interview authors, I feel it's a courtesy to read the book. So I'm force-feeding myself to read a lot of books. So that's how I do it. And then I read the books pretty carefully, but I'm reading books on subjects I know something about. If I had to read a science textbook, I probably couldn't get through it. But I'm reading biographies, business books, history books, and I know the subject matter reasonably well, so I can read it pretty quickly. And then what I do is when I'm preparing an interview, I then write down an outline of what I want to ask people. But I'm doing things I really want to do. I want to interview people. I want to read the book, so it's not a chore. And I'm not doing anything that's a chore. At this point in my life, everything I want to do, I'm doing. I'm not punishing myself by doing things I hate to do.
It strikes me that when I think of the enormity of what you do, to just read all those books and interview, and then to do that we described before, that it's almost like a Leonardo da Vinci. There must be a great passion that absorbs you. How do you do this in time? How do you manage your time?
Well, I don't have the IQ of so many people that got perfect SATs and won Nobel Prize. I'm not at that level for sure. But it's just my theory has always been I'm not as smart as I would like to be or as smart as some people I know. But if I work harder, I can catch up to some extent. So that's what I've done.
When do you wake up? When do you go to bed?
I try to get about 5.5 hours of sleep a night. Now, Jeff Bezos, when I interviewed him, disappointed me by saying he gets 8 hours every night. He can't get by with less than 8 hours. And so I said, my God, how am I going to, no wonder I'm not doing as well as Jeff Bezos. 8 hours every night. I get by in about 5.5 hours a night, and that seems to be okay.
Next question here. What do you think about the U.S. economy with inflation? Low unemployment, and polarity?
Well, you are better to answer that than me, but I'll give it my stab first, and you can comment as well. Look, the U.S. economy right now is not technically in recession. Europe is more likely to be in a recession, in my view, than we are. I think the Asian and Chinese economy that are slowing down. They're not, I guess, China's not in a technical recession now, but The U.S. economy is trying to deal with the problem. We injected $5 trillion into the economy. Obviously, it has an inflationary impact, and what happens in Ukraine is having an inflationary impact as well. And trying to absorb the $5 trillion and the energy price increases has given us very high inflation, and now we're trying to deal with it with higher interest rates, which generally, throughout the course of history, when you raise interest rates enough, as you know better than anybody, it tends to produce a so-called hard landing, which is a euphemism for recession. So I don't know that we're going into one, but I think right now we're tiptoeing around it. And I don't like to use the word recession. You may have heard me say before that when I worked in the Carter White House, the inflation advisor to Carter said, I think we're going into a recession. And the press got all upset about it. And Carter called him in and said, how can you agitate the press by saying we're going to recession? Don't use the R word. So this man, Fred Kahn, a former professor at Cornell, said, okay, I won't use the R word anymore. And he went out and said, I think we might be heading into a banana. And he used the word banana as an exchange word because he knew reporters weren't going to write a headline that says, Carter's inflation advisor thinks we're heading into banana. So we could be heading into a banana, but it's too early to say. And you let me know.
Great answer. Great answer.
Okay.
5 pieces of advice, maybe you don't have time for all 5, to give your kids regarding their, I think that says resources and how they thrive in the workplace.
Well, work hard, prepare. Don't think your father's going to give you a lot of money. Try to be respectful of other people and try to do something useful with your life so that your parents and your children will think that your life was a meaningful life. So in my case, since I'm the only child of my parents, there was probably slightly more pressure on me to achieve something, though they didn't have high ambitions for me. So, one of the greatest thrills of my life is making my parents happy because they lived long enough to see some of the things I did. But interestingly, when my mother passed away, and I went through her possessions, she had all the news clips of me, but not of any of the things that Carlisle had done or money I'd made. It was all about the gifts I had given. And she had told me that when I was giving away money that she was more proud of me for that than anything else. So, when you can make your mother proud, that's a good thing. And, particularly if it's Jewish mother, much prouder.
That's joyous. What's your view of American journalism?
Well, American journalism has suffered a lot because newspapers are closing down. The newspaper business is not quite what it was. Now, obviously, things are online. American journalists, I think, do a great service for our country because they're relatively modestly paid compared to private equity people, let's say. And they're trying to provide the truth, but sometimes some people on the far left or the far right exaggerate things to make headlines that may be unfair. But generally, I'd say the state of American journalism is pretty good.
You think the state of American journalism is pretty good?
Generally. I mean, obviously...
How many exceptions do we have?
Well, there are some people that have criticized me, and I don't think those people are so good. But I'd say generally, most of the journalists I know at reputable publications are interested in giving the facts as they see them. But obviously, every human has biases. And there's nobody that's perfect. So sometimes they may tilt slightly to the left or slightly to the right. And, everybody would like to have journalism right down the middle, but it's hard to do that.
There was a question here about the types of assets that should be held in this environment. Should they be hard assets? And what percentage of your wealth would you invest in those assets? And I might also ask you about crypto.
Okay, like on hard assets, you mean real estate or
I presume that's what they're referring to.
Throughout the course of the world, the most common investment has been real estate. That's the asset that most people have had. And when people get wealthier, they tend to buy other things, they make other investments. But I think for most people, their biggest investment is their house, for most people. Now, that's not for everybody, but for most people. And I think having some real estate is probably a reasonably good investment because it tends not to go down in value as a general rule of thumb. The problems that people get in real estate is when they over-lever it and when they over-lever it with personal guarantees. But generally, I think real estate and hard assets are a reasonable thing to have. Crypto is a more complicated subject, but I'd say as a general rule of thumb, look to what young people are investing in because young people and what they're doing with their lives, they tend to be much more likely to set the trends for people like you and me. So if younger people are investing in crypto, for example, it's not something you should ignore, because in the end, younger people are going to keep doing it if it works reasonably well. And we've seen crypto has done well for some people. I interviewed Sam Bankman-Fried the other day, who at one point was worth $23 billion. He's 30 years old. He's a crypto guy. And there are other people I've interviewed in the book, Mike Novogratz, who's a crypto investor as well. I think crypto is not going away, in part because they've done a very good job in the crypto industry of lobbying Congress to not have it unduly legislated and unduly regulated. I also think that the Russian oligarchs' confiscation of their assets by other governments has made people think, who have money, wait a second, somebody could come and do something like that to me. So I want to have some of my assets in some things that nobody knows I have, that are able to be transported around the world, and the government can't devalue it. So I think you're going to see crypto not going away. Now, the U.S. government will eventually have its own digital currency, which is not a cryptocurrency, but I think digital assets and digital currencies will be here for a long time.
What is your best guess of how the U.S. and China relationship will proceed over the next 10 years?
Well, you know China much better than I do. You can comment as well. I've spent a lot of time there. We've invested a lot of money. I used to go there many times a year. It's harder to go there, obviously, now. And I don't think you haven't been able to go for a while either. I would say that the U.S.-China relationship is as bad as any time since Nixon went to China. And in the Carter administration, we actually officially recognized China for the first time. Nixon went and did other things there, but we officially recognized them during the Carter years. And I would say the relationship is terrible now, in part because the political pressure in the United States to be against China is very high. There's no political benefit in the United States on saying, I really think China is being nice to us and we should be more accommodating. There's no political benefit to it. Take, for example, the tariffs that President Trump put on. That would be deflationary to take those tariffs off. And the administration recognized that, but they don't take them off because it would be seen as being weak on China. And you can't get anywhere politically in this country by being seen as weak on China. So I think it's going to have to wait to another presidential election and some other things happen. Now, maybe when Xi Jinping has officially gotten his third term and he feels less pressure, maybe he'll be more accommodating. The President of the United States historically meets the President of China the first year of his administration. President Biden hasn't been able to do that. They're probably going to have a brief meeting in the G20 summit in Asia not too long from now, but it's not going to be a meeting that they would say anything of great accomplishment is going to occur.
If we stop doing business with China the way we stopped doing business with Russia, does that concern you?
Well, it would. Now, Russia, we get virtually nothing from Russia. We get vodka from Russia. There's some people in Europe who obviously get energy from Russia, but Russia doesn't make a lot of things that we really need, and it's not a central part to the global economy, not a central part to the U.S. economy. China has become, over the last 40 years, a central part of our economy. So if we were to say we're not going to take any products from China, the inflation will really skyrocket because the products we're buying from China now, we're buying them because they're lower cost than the ones we can produce in this country. So I think it would have a damaging effect on our economy if we were to say we're not going to import anything from China. I think that would be a mistake.
Which book did you learn the most of, or would you most like to recommend?
Principles by Ray Dalio.
That's the right answer. Right. You got the right answer.
That is a best-selling book. Sold more than 2 million copies in China, and it's a very, very thoughtful book. So I would highly recommend that.
But picking a second,
depends on the purpose. If you're if you're going to be on an island, and you have nothing, that's going to have one book, what would be the one book you would take? Obviously the Bible, because it has so much in there, so much history, so much other things in it. But if it's not the Bible, I would say How to Invest is probably the book.
On that desert island.
Right.
We've evolved a long way.
Right.
A question here was, both of you have a sense of humility. What is your belief or source of that?
A lot to be humble about, is what I would say. Look, I recognize, when I was growing up, there were always people smarter, better athletes, better looking, more charming, everything. And so, as I said in my book on leadership, I had a theory that there are three parts to life. The first third is when people were some of the superstars, the Rhodes Scholars and so forth. very often they peter out and they don't live up to the potential. In fact, of the presidents of the United States, probably only one in the last 100 years was somebody who could be said to be a superstar when he was young. That was Bill Clinton, who was a Rhodes Scholar. Most of the people who rise up to be president of the United States were not superstars or anything when they were younger. And so my theory to justify my good luck is to say, well, if you're not so good in the first third, maybe you can work hard like a tortoise catch up in the second and third. But I try to have a fair amount of humility because I know all my weaknesses, all mistakes I've made, and all the things I should have done better. So it's not that hard for me to be humble.
I would agree. I'd say that, because it was asked for both of us, I would say getting banged up a lot, making mistakes, is one of those things that teaches you a fear that you're going to make mistakes, which still can't stand in the way of your audacity to do great things and think differently. So we are both making decisions in ways where we know that we can fail. I have a principle, pain plus reflection equals progress.
Right.
I mean, that's, so I think that it's just a natural course. And so success is achieved through failure and the learning that comes of it. I think
Absolutely.
most people would know.
I mean, you had challenges. We had challenges at the beginning of Carlisle. We had a lot of challenges and just got lucky.
What do you think is most misunderstood about our political system today, particularly internally and then by those outside?
Well, how significant money is to it. I mean, money is so significant to this the system we have now that campaign donations just drive it. And we call them campaign donations. You can call them something else. In other countries, we call them something else. But it's driving politics so much so. And it's just unfortunate that people are willing to appeal to the baser instincts of people on the left or right. And the result is you've got a divided government. And the divided government, we can blame Congress for being unable to get anything done, but Congress really reflects the American people. And the country is split down the middle ideologically, and it's not likely to change that much. When John Kennedy ran for president, Richard Nixon campaigned in all 50 states, and I think John Kennedy campaigned in about 45 states, because they didn't know how all these states were going to go. Today, we know how every state's going to go, with the exception of about 8 or 9 states. And so therefore the country is pretty divided red and blue, and there are very few people in between in so-called purple states. And it's much different than it was in 1960.
So the power of the moneyed class to influence politics, and then when you're comparing that to knowing that people can come from any class and you don't know where they're coming from, does that concern you?
Well, the money class throughout history has more influence than the non-money class historically, except when it gets to a revolution. Then you tend to have people at the bottom of society rising up and saying we're going to overthrow the system, the French Revolution or other things like that. But or the
That's
American
what I mean.
Right. Well, the money class has a disproportionate amount of influence in most societies, in any society. There's a lot in this country for sure, a lot of influence, and I've been surprised that there hasn't been more, I would say, reaction against it, more significant reaction against it. There has been some, obviously, but we haven't had rioting in the streets over some of the things that the so-called money class might want. It might happen at some time, but generally the country has a big safety net, not perfect for everybody, and obviously a lot of people are still suffering, and we have enormous amounts of homeless people around this town and other major cities. But as a general rule, I don't see a big social uprising against the money class generally.
In history, in the arcs, combination of large wealth gaps, large values gaps, bad economic conditions, and a lot of debt, a lot of printing of money. And then in history, even acts of nature, droughts, floods, and so on. When there's stress, it's a real stress test. Do you think that it's an environment that we can hold up under those stress tests well, or are you concerned?
Well, the United States is a pretty stable country, relatively speaking. There are some countries where the governments are falling all the time. There's military coups. We're not likely to have that. So I think the stability of our country is one of the things the Constitution has helped ensure. And I think it's interesting that in this country, we don't swear an allegiance to a leader. We swear an allegiance to the Constitution. That's what the oath of office is about. In other countries, they don't swear an allegiance to the Constitution. They swear an allegiance to the government in power, typically. So we have made the reverence for our founding fathers and reverence for our Constitution paramount, and I think it's difficult to have a overthrow of that so easily. Obviously, we've been challenged recently on that, but I think it's unlikely that we're going to have a military coup or social unrest such that the entire government will be overthrown. I think that's unlikely.
And how would you contrast or compare what the United States is like today versus when you graduated from high school?
Well, when I grew up, when I graduated from high school in 1966, the United States population was probably 220 million people. Today it's 330 million, so it's a third bigger. Today, in those days, civil rights was just beginning to come to the table. The school that I went to, Duke University, was segregated up until 1963, as were other southern schools like Rice, Tulane, Emory, Vanderbilt. So we've made a lot of progress in that. The Ivy League schools, when I was going to college, were by and large male-oriented. Not all of them, but Harvard, Yale, and Princeton were all male. So the world has changed in that sense as well. There's many different changes in the country, but I think the country is wealthier than it was, but the wealth is more at the top than it was before. When the Forbes 400 list was first put together in 1981, I think it was, to be on that list, you had to have a net worth of 125 million. They got you in the top 400. Today, it's probably 2 or 3 billion, I guess. So the wealth, now obviously there's some inflation, but the wealth aggregating at the top is just staggering when you think about it.
Well, I see that we're running out of time.
So let me ask you one question.
Okay.
So if you wanted to give advice to somebody how to be a great investor, and you built a great company, it's the largest hedge fund in the world, and I think if I have it right, you have produced more profits for your investors than any other hedge fund in history. That's pretty nice. So if you were giving advice to somebody who wanted to start a hedge fund today, what would you tell that person to do?
Well, you have to have the passion of the game. You ran down your list pretty good, I think. You have to have the passion of the game. You have to know your nature. You have to know what you're good at and what you're not good at, and have people around you who are good at the things that you're not good at. You certainly have to have the humility. You have to be, you have to love the ride. It's a roller coaster. And then you have to learn from it. I think you have to learn how to diversify so that, I think the most important thing that you could learn is how you can dramatically reduce your risk without reducing your return, by knowing how to balance risk well in terms of the different kinds of investments that you make. And I think you have to have that humility and that curiosity that you're talking about to pull the best out of that, to have people stress test your thinking. I think that those are elements for being a good investor, and they may help other ways. I think your list was a very good list, that you have to be an independent thinker against the consensus. In order to make money in the markets, you have to bet against the consensus and be right. You have to bet against the consensus because the consensus is in the price. So you have to bet against the consensus, and you have to be right. So you have to have that element that you referred to. I think those are the elements.
Well, I would also want to add, for the average investor is not going to be Ray Dalio or some of the other people that I have in the book who are the best in the venture world or whatever. The average person should not put too much in any one asset class or one investment. The average person, in my view, should read what they're investing in and learn about it so they know what, if they're investing in a fund, know what the fees are, know what the valuations are, know how to get access to the information, know how to ask the right questions, and also don't expect to be a genius in the investment world. If you're a genius in making widgets, it's very unlikely you're also going to be a genius in investing. Sometimes people are so brilliant, they think I've built a great new company, I can do anything, but it's not that easy to do. And the people who are in this book are people who've been in it for their whole career. There's very few people who are making a staggering fortunes in the first 5 years of their investment career. It rarely happens. It takes a long time to do it. So this is a book that's really designed to have the average person see what the great people did, learn a little bit from it, but I have my own views in there about what people should do with their own money, and that's obviously diversify, know what you're doing, read up, be on top of it, and don't try to make a fortune in your investment on the side business, because it's not likely to happen.
Yeah, I'd say there are two types of being an investor. There is, I have money that I need to invest, and then there is receiving money or having money themselves and making an investment decision. On the first type, you're trying to pick an investor.
Right.
Who will invest for you in what? Because you know that you're not going to be the pro it's like you're not going to be your own doctor. You're not going to be your own investor. So the skill that is required to pick the right investments, but not only the right investments, but the right investment managers are different skills, they're different skills than the skill to be a professional investor. It's like being a specialist. If we use the medical example, there's the generalist who will pick the right doctors for you. And then there's being a specialist. So you're a specialist in private equity. I'm a specialist in what I do, global macro and liquid markets. So I think it depends on what you're doing. And so for the average person, I think that as you're referring to, you have to know that competing in the markets is more difficult than competing in the Olympics, because there's more people trying to do it and it's a zero-sum game. And so that kind of humility, and you have to be able to pick well. That's why I think when you said fees, pay attention to fees, pay attention to track records, pay attention to diversification of asset classes, and then because people do it, pay attention to changes in the people who are going to be managing the money, I would think.
What I say in the book is this: if you're picking a fund, look at the track record. Make sure the people who produce the track record are still there. Make sure they have a lot of their own money invested alongside you. Make sure that the young people are not leaving the firm because they're not being adequately incented. Make sure the organization is not being sued for fraud all the time. Make sure that the organization is one where you can get the information you want when you want it and on an understandable basis. Make sure the fees are fair, and make sure you know who the other investors are, because smart money knows how to find good investments, and you've never heard of anybody else investing alongside you. That's not a good thing.
I think that this is a great contribution, because everybody is an investor. When your dad saved, he was an investor. And so everybody's an investor. And this book and that list is a tremendous contribution to others. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you for taking the time, Ray, and thank you for all coming. And I appreciate everybody's coming. I didn't know whether they thought this was going to be Rubenstein or Springsteen here. So I think part of the crowd thought this was going to be Springsteen showing up again, but no, it wasn't. But thank you all very much, and thank you, Ray.
Thank you.